The ship's warning klaxon pierced Ken's concentration as red lights flooded the cockpit. His hands flew across the control panel, fighting against the rapidly failing systems of his research vessel, the Starweaver. Computer, status report. Multiple system failures detected. Primary engine offline. Secondary systems compromised. Atmospheric entry imminent. The AI's voice remained eerily calm as the ship plummeted toward the unknown planet below. Through the view screen, a world of vibrant purples and blues filled his vision. The planet Irza, unmapped, uncharted, and definitely not where he'd planned to make an emergency landing. Ken gritted his teeth as he wrestled with the controls, the ship shuddering violently around him. Calculating survival probability, the computer chimed. Don't bother, Ken muttered, engaging what remained of the landing thrusters. Just tell me if we'll make it through Atmo without burning up. The ship bucked and rolled as it hit the upper atmosphere, temperature readings climbing dangerously. Hull integrity warnings flashed across his screens as the Starweaver carved a fiery path through Urza's sky. Ken spotted a break in the dense forest canopy below, his only shot at a somewhat controlled crash. He yanked the controls hard, directing the failing ship toward the clearing. The ground rushed up to meet him with frightening speed. Brace for impact in 3, 2. The world exploded into chaos. Metal screamed against Earth as the Starweaver plowed through the alien soil, leaving a deep furrow in its wake. Ken's safety harness dug into his shoulders as the ship finally ground to a halt, steam hissing from its wounded hull. When the dust settled, Ken's first thought was that he must have hit his head harder than he realized. The forest around his crash site, it was glowing. Pulses of bioluminescent light rippled through the vegetation in waves of blue and green, almost like the plants were responding to the chaos of his landing. Computer, atmosphere analysis. Atmosphere composition within human-compatible parameters. Warning, unknown biological agents detected. Recommend sealed environment suit for initial survey. Ken nodded, already reaching for his emergency gear. He sealed his environment suit and grabbed his scanner and emergency pack before popping the airlock. The moment he stepped outside, the forest glow intensified. Wherever his boots touched the ground, rings of purple light spread outward through the moss-like growth covering the forest floor. Incredible, he breathed, watching as his scanner tried to make sense of the readings. Some kind of heightened electromagnetic sensitivity in the local flora? Or maybe a flash of movement caught his eye. Something darted between the trees. Something distinctly humanoid. Ken's hand instinctively moved to his hip where his pulse pistol was holstered. "Hello?" he called out, keeping his voice steady. "I mean no harm. My ship was damaged and I had to make an emergency landing." The forest went eerily still. Even the bioluminescent pulses seemed to hold their breath. Then she stepped into view, and Ken forgot how to breathe. She was tall, easily matching his 6-foot frame, with skin the color of twilight sky. Her features were sharp, almost predatory, framed by what looked like living vines that moved with a life of their own. But it was her eyes that held him frozen. They literally glowed with an inner fire that made the forest's light show pale in comparison. The plants around her shifted from their peaceful blues to angry reds and oranges. Ken's scanner suddenly went haywire, readings spiking off the charts. I love what you've done with the place," he said, trying for a disarming smile. "The way you make everything light up. It's beautiful." "You're beautiful, actually, if you don't mind me saying." Her expression darkened. The vines in her hair writhed more violently as she raised her hand. Before Ken could react, the ground beneath his feet erupted with thorny vines that wrapped around his legs. "Whoa! Hey, let's talk about this!" Ken yelped, trying to maintain his balance as more vines snaked up his body. "Hunter," she hissed, the words somehow both melodic and threatening. "You think to consume my essence with your sweet words and strange weapons? Consume your... what? No. No consuming of any kind." Ken struggled against the botanical restraints. "Look, I have food. Actual food. You want to see?" He slowly reached for his pack with his one free hand. Movements deliberate and non-threatening. The warrior watched with narrowed eyes as he pulled out a sealed ration pack. "See? Just normal space rations. Probably tastes terrible, but it's not. Whatever you think I'm here for. She approached cautiously, the forest pulsing with tense amber light around them. Her fingers, long and elegant despite their obvious strength, plucked the ration pack from his hand. She studied it with intense curiosity. This is what your kind consumes? Well, yeah, when we have to. Though I'd kill for a real burger right about now. He immediately regretted his choice of words as her posture tensed again. Figure of speech. Just a figure of speech. She circled him slowly, still clutching the ration pack. You crashed here deliberately. Trust me, nothing about that landing was deliberate. My ship's systems failed, and I barely managed to avoid becoming a very attractive crater. He gestured toward the Star Weaver's smoking form. I just need to repair my ship, and I'll be out of your territory? Kingdom? Whatever this is. The warrior was silent for a long moment, studying him with those burning eyes. Finally, the vines loosened their grip slightly. I am Rena, she declared, and you will remain under my watch while you repair your vessel. Any attempt to harvest power from our world or its people will result in your immediate execution. Ken let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I'm Ken, and I promise, the only thing I'll be harvesting is whatever spare parts I can salvage from my ship's backup systems. The vines retreated completely, slithering back into the ground as if they'd never existed. Rena maintained her defensive stance, but the forest's colors had shifted to a more neutral purple. You are different from the hunters in our stories, she said almost accusingly. Ken brushed himself off, trying to restore some dignity. I'll take that as a compliment, though I have to say, you're pretty different from any welcoming committee I've ever met. A ghost of something, curiosity, amusement, flickered across her face before she suppressed it. Begin your repairs. I will observe. As Ken turned back toward his ship, he couldn't help but notice how the forest's lights seemed to dance between them, creating patterns he couldn't begin to understand. Whatever he'd stumbled into, he had a feeling his life was about to become a lot more interesting. And dangerous, he reminded himself, feeling Rena's burning gaze on his back. Definitely dangerous. The next few hours proved to be an exercise in diplomatic multitasking as Ken attempted to assess his ship's damage while keeping his mysterious guardian appeased. The Star Weaver's hull had taken the worst of it, with deep gashes along the port side where they'd skidded across the ground. Initial damage assessment complete, Ken muttered to himself, tapping notes into his datapad. Primary power couplings severed, atmospheric regulators compromised, and great, navigational arrays completely shot. You speak to yourself, Rena observed from her perch on a nearby boulder. The surrounding plants had formed a sort of living throne around her, their luminescence pulsing in sync with her movements. Is this a hunter's ritual? Ken glanced up from his work. More like a bad habit. Helps me think. He frowned at a particularly nasty-looking breach in the hull. And right now, I'm thinking I'm going to need some local materials to patch this up. The forest glow shifted to a wary amber. What materials? Nothing dramatic. Some metal-bearing ore would be ideal, but I could work with certain types of crystalline formations if... He trailed off as Rena's expression darkened. Let me guess. Harvesting local resources is off the table? The Earth's bones are sacred, she stated firmly. We do not permit outsiders to take from them. Ken ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. Look, I understand you've got rules, but without proper repairs, this ship isn't going anywhere. And somehow, I don't think you want me setting up permanent residence here. A series of rapid color changes rippled through the surrounding vegetation. Red to purple to a deep blue that made Ken think of ocean depths. Rena's brow furrowed in what appeared to be internal debate. There may be alternatives, she said finally. The Great Storm 2 cycles ago brought down one of your kind's vessels in the northern reaches. What remains is considered cursed ground. If you wish to scavenge from there, none would object. Another crashed ship? Ken's pulse quickened. Any idea what type? How long ago was this storm in standard years? You ask many questions, Hunter. Researcher, he corrected automatically. I'm a researcher, and questions are kind of part of the job description. Something that might have been amusement flickered in her glowing eyes. Your kind's measures of time mean nothing to us? It was two great cycles, when the twin moons align and the forest sings its deepest songs. Ken made a mental note to figure out the local astronomical calendar later. And this wreck, how far are we talking? Rena rose from her living throne, the plants reluctantly unwinding from around her. 3 days' journey through the deep forest, but night approaches and the forest grows, hungry when darkness falls. As if on cue, the quality of light around them began to shift. The gentle bioluminescence took on sharper edges, and Ken could have sworn he heard something that sounded suspiciously like a growl from the underbrush. "Right," he said, securing his tools. "Shelter first, salvage mission later. I don't suppose you'd be willing to point me towards somewhere safe to set up camp?" Rena's expression was unreadable. "The trees here hunger for fresh energy. Your vessel's barriers may not hold against their night feeding." She seemed to come to a decision. "You will follow me to the high caves. Try to keep pace. I will not slow for you." Without waiting for a response, she turned and began moving through the forest with fluid grace. The plants literally parted before her, creating a path that immediately closed behind her passing. "Wait!" Ken called, scrambling to grab his emergency pack. "What about my ship?" "The forest will not consume metal," she called back, already disappearing into the glowing undergrowth, "though I make no promises about smaller creatures seeking its warmth." Ken took one last look at the Star Weaver before jogging to catch up. The forest was definitely darker now, and the sounds emerging from it were becoming decidedly less welcoming. "So these trees," he puffed, trying to keep pace with Rena's effortless stride, "they actually feed on energy? Like some kind of botanical vampire?" "Your words are strange," she replied without slowing. "But yes, they hunger, especially for the bright energy of living things. Your own life force burns particularly strong. It draws them." "That's not terrifying at all." Ken ducked under a branch that seemed to reach for him a bit too eagerly. "And these caves we're heading to? Sacred ground. Protected." She glanced back at him, her eyes cutting through the growing darkness. "Though some might say bringing you there is a greater risk than leaving you to the forest's hunger. You really know how to make a guy feel welcome." A sound escaped her then, something between a scoff and a chuckle. "Welcome? You are tolerated hunter who claims to be researcher. Do not mistake tolerance for trust." As they climbed higher into the hills, Ken couldn't help but notice how the forest's light seemed to follow Rena's movements, creating a dance of colors that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so alien. She moved like a predator, yet there was a grace to her that spoke of something more than mere warrior training. "The caves are just ahead," she announced as they crested a ridge. "And hunter?" "Researcher," he corrected again, breathing heavily from the climb. "If you attempt to research any of our sacred sites or my people while you rest—" The threat hung unfinished in the air between them. Ken raised his hands in surrender. "Noted. No research, no harvesting, no consuming of essences. I'm starting to think you guys have had some really bad visitors in the past." For the first time, something like genuine emotion crossed Rena's face. A shadow of old pain quickly masked. "You have no idea, Starfaller. You have no idea." The cave entrance loomed before them, its walls covered in bioluminescent moss that pulsed with gentle blue light. As they entered, Ken noticed intricate markings etched into the stone, ancient symbols that seemed to tell a story. "Amazing," he breathed, reaching out to trace one of the glowing patterns. "These markings." Rena caught his wrist with lightning speed, her touch sending an unexpected tingle through his arm. "Do not touch. These are the stories of change, sacred histories of when Irza transformed." "Transformed?" Ken lowered his hand but didn't step back, acutely aware of how close they were standing. The cave's light played across Rena's blue skin, creating mesmerizing patterns. "What do you mean?" Rena released his wrist slowly, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. "Long ago, before the Great Change, Urza was different. The outsiders came with their experiments, their attempts to reshape life itself. They saw our world as nothing but a laboratory." The cave walls seemed to respond to her emotions, the moss shifting to deeper, darker blues. "Their bioengineering changed everything. The plants, the animals, even the very air we breathe. My people, she hesitated. We were also changed, enhanced, improved, they said, made stronger, faster, more resilient. You're the result of genetic engineering? Ken asked softly, pieces falling into place. That's why you thought I was here to consume your essence? You thought I was like them? The hunters came after, Rena continued, moving deeper into the cave. They heard tales of the enhanced warriors of Irsa, of our strength, our abilities. They believed that by consuming our flesh, our blood, they could gain our power. Her voice hardened. Many tried, none succeeded. Ken followed her, careful to keep a respectful distance. I'm not like them, Rena. I'm just a researcher interested in xenobotany, the study of alien plant life. Your world's ecosystem is unlike anything I've ever seen. Pretty word, Oz, she scoffed, but there was less hostility in her tone. Yet you crash from the stars, armed and alone, with devices that measure life itself. My scanner? It's just a scientific instrument, not a weapon. He pulled it out slowly, offering it to her. Here, let me show you. Rena tensed as he approached, the cave moss flaring bright red around them. But curiosity seemed to win over caution, and she leaned in to examine the device. Her hair brushed his shoulder, carrying an exotic scent like night-blooming flowers. See these readings? Ken pointed to the display, trying to ignore how the proximity made his heart race. They show the incredible energy patterns in your forest, the way the plants respond to emotions, to life itself. It's revolutionary. And you truly wish only to study? Her eyes met his, searching. Not to take, not to consume? Well, Ken smiled slightly. I wouldn't mind consuming some actual food. Those ration packs aren't exactly gourmet dining. A startled laugh escaped her, a sound so surprising that even she seemed shocked by it. The cave's lights rippled with warm golden hues. You are very strange, she declared, stepping back, but with less wariness than before. Most who face me either cower in fear or attack in desperation. You make jokes. Humor's a survival mechanism, Ken shrugged. Besides, if you were going to feed me to your carnivorous plants, you probably would have done it by now. The night is still young, she reminded him, but there was a hint of playfulness in her voice. Rest here. I must inform my sisters of your presence before they sense you themselves. That would be less pleasant. As she turned to leave, Ken called after her. Rena, thank you for not letting the forest eat me. She paused at the cave entrance, her silhouette rimmed by the otherworldly glow of Irsa's night. Perhaps I simply prefer my prey well-rested before the hunt. With that, she was gone, leaving Ken to wonder if she was joking, and when exactly he'd started finding deadly warrior women quite so intriguing. The cave moss pulsed knowingly around him, its colors shifting to a teasing pink that made him suspect the plants, at least, understood exactly what he was feeling. Ken was studying the cave markings when Rena returned, moving so silently he only noticed her presence when the moss brightened in response. She carried what appeared to be local fruits and something that steamed in a carved wooden bowl. Your ration packs offend me, she announced, setting the food down. If you must stay, you will eat properly. I'm touched by your concern for my dietary habits, Ken grinned, settling down cross-legged near the offerings. Though I hope this isn't the part where you fatten me up before the feast? Rena's eyes narrowed, but the cave's responsive lighting betrayed her amusement with flickers of gold. Your constant references to being eaten are peculiar, says the woman who thought I was going to consume her essence an hour ago. He examined one of the fruits. It was deep purple and seemed to glow faintly from within. Is this safe for humans? The changed ones made sure all life here would be compatible, she said, gracefully folding herself down opposite him. The fruit is called Nightheart. It responds to body heat. As if to demonstrate, she picked up one of the fruits. It brightened at her touch, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Ken found himself mesmerized by the display. Beautiful, he murmured, not entirely referring to the fruit. The cave's light shifted to that knowing pink again, and Rena shot an irritated look at the walls. The cave moss is overly expressive, she said stiffly. It lacks proper restraint. Ken took a bite of the night heart. Sweet warmth flooded his mouth along with complex flavors he couldn't begin to describe. Oh, wow, that's incredible. You seem easily impressed, Rena observed, but she looked pleased. By bioluminescent fruit that tastes like liquid starlight? Yeah, I'd say that's pretty impressive. He gestured at their surroundings. This whole planet is amazing. I've visited dozens of worlds, but I've never seen anything like Irsa. And yet your kind tried to improve upon it. There was an edge to her voice now. They thought they could perfect nature itself. Ken set down the fruit, choosing his next words carefully. What was done here? It wasn't right. Playing God with an entire ecosystem, with people's lives. That's not what science should be about. What should it be about then, researcher? The way she said his title made it sound almost like a challenge. Understanding, learning, appreciating the wonders that already exist. He met her gaze steadily. Like how your plants respond to emotions, or how you can communicate with them. That's not something that needs improving. It needs understanding. The cave's light softened to a gentle lavender as Rena considered his words. And what of me, Ken? Am I simply another wonder to be understood? There was something in her tone that made his pulse quicken. I think you're probably more than I could understand in a lifetime, he said honestly, but I'd like to try. The moss flared bright pink again, and this time Rena didn't glare at it. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes seeming to glow brighter. Your words are dangerous, Starfaller? More dangerous than your carnivorous plants? Perhaps. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. The plants only hunger for energy. Words. Words can hunger for more. Ken became acutely aware of how the space between them had somehow decreased. The air seemed charged with something more than just the cave's bioluminescence. Is that why your people isolate themselves? He asked softly. Fear of dangerous words. We isolate ourselves because trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. She reached out and touched the scanner, still clipped to his belt. Your devices measure life, yes, but they cannot measure intent, cannot measure truth. And how do you measure truth? Rena's fingers moved from the scanner to rest lightly on his wrist, just above his pulse point. The touch sent sparks of electricity through his skin. We feel it in the rhythm of life itself. The cave moss pulsed in time with their heartbeats now, creating a synchronized light show that would have been distracting if Ken could tear his attention away from Rena's face. And what does my rhythm tell you? He asked, barely above a whisper. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable but intense. Finally, she withdrew her hand, though the sensation of her touch lingered. It tells me you are either the most honest hunter I've ever met, she said, rising gracefully to her feet, or the most dangerous. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Ken pointed out. Rena paused at the cave's entrance, looking back over her shoulder. The night forest created a backdrop of shifting colors behind her. No, she agreed with a slight smile. They're not. Sleep well, researcher. Tomorrow we see if your actions match your rhythms. She melted into the darkness, leaving Ken alone with the knowing moss and the lingering warmth of her touch on his skin. Dawn on Irza painted the sky in impossible colors, deep purples bleeding into electric blues and greens that no Earth sunrise could match. Ken emerged from the cave to find Rena already waiting, her silhouette stark against the alien dawn. Your forest is showing off, he said, nodding toward where the morning light made the bioluminescent plants shimmer like liquid jewels. The forest responds to all strong emotions, Rena replied, turning to face him. In the dawn light, her blue skin seemed to glow from within, including wonder. Is that what's causing this display? My wonder? Ken stepped closer, noticing how the plants near his feet shifted color to match his movement. Partly. Her eyes met his, that inner fire still burning bright even in daylight. You project your feelings strongly. It's unsettling. Sorry, he grinned, not feeling sorry at all. I'll try to emote more quietly. The corner of her mouth twitched. You are making fun again. Just trying to lighten the mood, though your plants seem to be handling that just fine. He gestured to where the vegetation had taken on a warm, golden hue around them. Rena glanced at the betraying Flora with annoyance. They lack discipline. Come, we should check your ship before the sun rises fully. They made their way down the hillside, following a path that seemed to form itself before them as Rena walked. Ken noticed she'd shortened her stride slightly, allowing him to keep pace more easily than the night before. So, he ventured as they walked, about these hunters you mentioned, the ones who tried to consume your essence. What exactly were they after? Rena's steps faltered slightly. Our strength, our speed, the changes made to us. She flexed her hand, and nearby vines twisted in response. Some believed they could take our abilities by force. By eating you, that's not how genetics work. Perhaps not, she agreed. But desperation rarely listens to science. They came with weapons, with traps, with sweet words and sweeter promises. Her voice hardened. All met the same end. Fed to your hungry plants? She shot him a look that might have been amusement. You are very focused on being eaten. Well, it was my introduction to your culture, Ken pointed out. First impressions tend to stick. They reached the crash site, where the Star Weaver sat like a wounded animal in its impact crater. The morning light revealed the damage was even worse than Ken had initially assessed. As he began checking the hull breach, he noticed Rena watching him intently. Something on your mind? You are not afraid, she said almost accusingly, even knowing what we do to those who threaten us. Ken straightened up from his inspection. Should I be? Yes. She moved closer, her movement liquid grace. Any sane being would fear us. Maybe I'm not sane, he suggested, very aware of how the space between them had shrunk. Or maybe I just don't think you're as threatening as you want to appear. The plants around them flared bright red, but Rena's expression remained controlled. You doubt my ability to harm you? No, Ken met her gaze steadily. I doubt your desire to. They stood there for a long moment, tension crackling between them like static electricity. The forest seemed to hold its breath, colors swirling in confused patterns around them. Finally, Rena spoke, her voice softer than he'd heard before. You are either very brave or very foolish, Ken of the Stars. I've been called both, he admitted, usually right before something either amazing or terrible happens. And which do you think this will be? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Before Ken could respond, a distant sound like a horn echoed through the forest. Rena stiffened, her warrior's posture returning instantly. My sisters approach, she said, stepping back. They wish to evaluate you. Evaluate? Ken raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried about this evaluation involving any taste testing? That startled another laugh from her, quickly suppressed. You truly cannot take anything seriously? I take lots of things seriously, he said, smiling. I just choose not to let fear stop me from appreciating the moment, even if that moment might end with me being lunch. You are, she seemed to search for the right word, impossible. I prefer optimistic, he corrected. Now about these sisters of yours. The horn sounded again, closer now. Rena's expression turned grave. Remember your words about trust and understanding, researcher. You may need them soon. As if on cue, the forest's colors shifted to deep, anticipatory purple, and Ken could hear the sound of approaching footsteps through the underbrush. Time to meet the family, he thought wryly, and hopefully avoid becoming breakfast in the process. The approaching Amazons emerged from the forest like living shadows, their blue skin various shades darker than Rena's. Unlike her, they wore elaborate armor that seemed to be grown rather than forged, living plates that shifted and moved with their bodies. Sisters, Rena addressed them formally, though Ken noticed the plants around her feet betrayed anxiety with flickering amber pulses. I bring news of the star-fallen one. The tallest Amazon, her armor adorned with what looked like crystallized starlight, stepped forward. We have felt the disturbance in the forest's song. This outsider's presence disrupts the harmony. Actually, Ken interjected, earning sharp looks from all present, your forest seems pretty enthusiastic about my presence. Look. He took a step forward, and the plants around him erupted in a display of welcoming colors. It responds to his emotions, Rena explained quickly. He projects strongly, but means no harm. So you say, sister. Another warrior circled Ken, her movements predatory. Yet you were tasked with eliminating threats, not harboring them. I don't suppose my vote counts in this elimination discussion? Ken asked cheerfully, though his hand instinctively moved closer to his pulse pistol. Rena shot him a look that clearly said, "Stop helping." He is a researcher, Venom. His ship crashed. He seeks only repairs and knowledge. Knowledge? The lead Amazon's voice dripped with skepticism. Like those who came before? Those who sought to know us by breaking us apart? With respect, Ken kept his voice level. If I wanted to harm anyone, starting with a crash landing seems like a pretty inefficient way to go about it. A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the group. The forest colors softened slightly. He makes jokes in the face of death, one of the younger warriors observed, either very brave or very foolish. That's what I said, Rena muttered, then straightened as the lead Amazon approached her. You vouch for this outsider, sister? The question carried heavy weight. You would stake your honor on his intentions? Ken watched Rena carefully. Her expression remained neutral, but the plants around her swirled with complex patterns of gold and blue. I sense no deception in him, she said finally. His rhythms speak truth, even when his words dance with levity. My words don't just dance, Ken added. Sometimes they do acrobatics. This time, several warriors failed to suppress their amusement. Even the leader's stern expression cracked slightly. Very well, she declared. He may remain under your watch, Rena. But he must prove his worth and intentions. She fixed Ken with a penetrating stare. 3 tasks will be set. Complete them, and we will assist with your repairs. Fail? Let me guess. I become plant food? You jest, she noted, but your understanding is correct. Wonderful. Ken glanced at Rena, who was studiously avoiding his gaze. Any hints about these tasks? Pop quiz? Scavenger hunt? Traditional dance number? The leader's eyes narrowed. The first task begins at moonrise. Rena will guide you. With that, she turned to leave, then paused. An outsider? Your humor will not save you if you prove false. As the warriors melted back into the forest, Ken turned to Rena. So, that went well? You are impossible, she said again. But there was something like relief in her voice. Most outsiders cower before the tribunal. Well, they're definitely intimidating, he admitted, but I was distracted by how the forest kept changing colors, and by how you defended me. The plants around Rena's feet turned that telling pink again. I spoke only truth. Your rhythms are unique. Is that a compliment or a diagnosis? He stepped closer, noting how she didn't back away this time. Perhaps both. Her eyes met his, that inner fire dancing. You should prepare for the trials. They will not be easy. Any advice? Yes. A small smile played at her lips. Try not to talk so much. Now that's just cruel, he grinned. Here I thought we were developing such a nice rapport. Rapport will not help you survive what comes next, she warned, but the forest betrayed her again, swirling with warm colors around them. Maybe not, Ken agreed, but it makes the whole potential death by plants thing much more enjoyable. Rena made an exasperated sound, but Ken caught the smile she tried to hide. Come, we must prepare you for the first trial. As they walked back toward the caves, Ken couldn't help but notice how the forest colors seemed to weave between them, creating patterns that looked suspiciously like dancing hearts. From Rena's determined refusal to look at the display, he suspected she noticed too. Maybe getting stranded on a planet of deadly warrior women wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a guy, he thought. Assuming, of course, he survived whatever trials awaited him. Inside the cave, Rena paced restlessly while Ken checked his equipment. The moss walls pulsed with her agitation, creating waves of anxious purple light. You're going to wear a path in the stone, Ken observed, testing his scanner's power cell. Want to tell me what's really bothering you? The first trial, she paused her pacing, fixing him with those intense eyes. It tests more than just strength or skill. It tests essence. You keep using that word. Ken set down his scanner. What exactly do you mean by essence? Rena approached, her movements fluid like water. Give me your hand. Ken extended his hand without hesitation, watching as she took it in both of hers. Her skin was warm, almost electric to the touch. The cave moss immediately brightened, casting them in a soft golden glow. Feel this? She pressed one thumb into his palm, sending a tingling sensation up his arm. This is life force, energy, what your science might call bioelectric fields, but it's more than that. It feels like static electricity, but alive, Ken murmured, fascinated by both the sensation and her proximity. This is what the hunters sought, she continued, her voice softer. Not just our physical strength, but this energy. The changes made us living conductors of life itself. Ken found himself studying her face, noting how the cave's light played across her features. Is that why you can communicate with the plants? Yes. Her fingers traced a pattern on his palm that made his breath catch. But the first trial will test your ability to harmonize with the forest, with everything. She released his hand, though the tingling sensation remained. Most outsiders cannot. Their energy is too discordant. Ken flexed his fingers, missing her touch more than he cared to admit. And what about my energy? Rena turned away, but not before he caught the flash of pink in her eyes that matched the cave walls. Your rhythm is unusual, strong but not aggressive, bright but not burning. I'm sensing a but coming. But, she turned back to face him, her expression serious. The trial requires more than just compatible energy. It requires surrender. Surrender? Ken raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound ominous at all. This is not a joke, Ken. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel that strange electrical field emanating from her skin. You must let the forest in. Let it read your true intentions, your deepest self. And if it doesn't like what it finds, then I will have vouched for you in vain. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. And I will have to watch as the forest claims you. The intensity in her eyes made his heart race. You seem pretty invested in my survival for someone who thought I was going to eat them yesterday. A small smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps I find your impossible nature intriguing. Just intriguing? He matched her quiet tone, aware of how the space between them had shrunk to almost nothing. The cave moss exploded in bright pink light, causing Rena to step back with a frustrated sound. The flora here has no sense of propriety? I don't know, Ken grinned. I think it's picking up on something real. You are too confident, but there was warmth in her voice. The trial may change that. Or it might surprise you. He gathered his courage and reached for her hand, mimicking her earlier gesture by tracing a pattern on her palm. Maybe I'm good at harmonizing. The touch sent a visible shiver through her, and the cave's light pulsed like a heartbeat. You play with forces you don't understand, Starfaller. Then teach me, he said simply. Rena stared at their joined hands, then slowly withdrew hers. Perhaps that is exactly what these trials are for. The horn sounded again in the distance, making them both look toward the cave entrance where twilight was beginning to fall. It's time, Rena said, her warrior's composure returning. Are you ready? Ken checked his equipment one last time, then gave her his most confident smile. Ready to surrender to a potentially lethal forest while being judged by warrior women who might feed me to their plants? Absolutely. You truly cannot take anything seriously, but her eyes sparkled with that inner fire. Oh, I'm taking this very seriously, he assured her as they headed toward the cave entrance. I'm just choosing to focus on the more pleasant aspects, like my very attractive guide. The cave moss flared one last time in brilliant pink as they left, and Ken could have sworn he heard Rena mumble something about impossible men under her breath. As they descended toward the trial grounds, the forest began to glow with anticipation, creating a path of light before them. Whatever was coming, Ken realized, would either forge something extraordinary or end very badly. Given the way Rena's hand brushed against his as they walked, he was betting on extraordinary. The trial grounds sprawled before them in a natural amphitheater, where ancient trees formed a perfect circle around a clearing. As Ken and Rena approached, the assembled warriors created an intimidating audience. their armored forms illuminated by the forest's anticipatory glow. The lead Amazon, whom Ken now knew as Elder Venna, stood at the circle's center. "The first trial begins," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the charged air. "Starfaller, step forward." Ken moved to enter the circle, but Rena caught his arm. "Remember," she whispered, "surrender to it. Don't fight." "No promises," he whispered back with a wink, "but I'll try not to end up as fertilizer." The look she gave him was equal parts exasperation and concern, but he noticed she didn't immediately release his arm. Inside the circle, the ground itself seemed alive with pulsing energy. Venna gestured and the surrounding trees began to glow with increasing intensity. "The circle of resonance will test your essence," she declared. "If your spirit proves true, the forest will harmonize. If not..." She left the threat unspoken. "Just to be clear," Ken couldn't help asking, "does harmonizing usually involve any actual musical talent? Because I should warn you, my singing voice..." "Silence," Venna commanded, though Ken caught several younger warriors hiding smiles. "Close your eyes. Open your energy. Let the forest read you." Ken complied, closing his eyes as the energy around him intensified. He could feel it now, like static electricity raising the hair on his arms, but more alive, conscious. "Your barriers," Venna's voice seemed to come from far away. "Lower them." Ken tried to relax, to surrender, as Rena had instructed. He thought of her touch earlier in the cave, that strange electrical connection. The forest's energy felt similar, but more wild, more primal. Something brushed against his consciousness, alien yet familiar, like fingers tracing patterns on his mind. The sensation was intimate, invasive, and his first instinct was to resist. "Don't fight it," Rena's voice cut through his tension. "Trust. Trust." Right. Because letting an alien forest probe his mind was totally normal. But as he forced himself to relax, to accept the strange presence, something extraordinary happened. The forest's energy didn't just examine him, it responded. Colors exploded behind his closed eyelids as his awareness expanded. He could feel everything: the tree's ancient wisdom, the soil's quiet strength, the very pulse of life flowing through Irsa's transformed ecosystem. And there, shining like a beacon among it all, was Rena's distinctive energy signature. Her presence burned bright with concern, hope, and something deeper that made his heart race. "Impossible," he heard Venna murmur. "The patterns..." Ken opened his eyes to find the clearing transformed. The forest's typical bioluminescence had erupted into a spectacular light show, with colors he'd never seen before dancing through the trees. The patterns swept outward from where he stood, creating intricate mandalas that seemed to reflect both his thoughts and the forest's response. But most striking was the bridge of light that had formed between him and Rena, their energies interweaving in a display that had the assembled warriors murmuring in astonishment. "Well," he managed, trying to sound casual despite his racing heart, "is this what harmonizing looks like? Because I've got to say, the light show alone was worth the price of admission." Rena stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder. "You didn't just harmonize," she said softly. "You connected. The forest, it's responding to you as if..." She trailed off, looking to Venna for explanation. The elder Amazon studied Ken with new intensity. "As if he were one of us," she finished. "The changes, they must have created resonance patterns, impossible patterns." "That word keeps coming up," Ken noted, still very aware of the energy dancing between him and Rena. "I'm starting to think it doesn't mean what you think it means." "The trial is complete," Venna announced, though her expression suggested she had more questions than answers. "You may proceed with your repairs under supervision." As the warriors began to disperse, Ken turned to Rena. "So did I pass with flying colors?" "Literally?" "You are the most impossible man I have ever met," she stated. But there was something new in her voice, a warmth that made the forest around them pulse with golden light. "I'll take that as a compliment," he grinned. "Now how about we celebrate my not becoming plant food with dinner? I promise not to make it a ritual challenge." Rena's laugh when it came was like music. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but first you must explain how you did this. No outsider has ever..." Connected like that? He stepped closer, noting how the light patterns between them intensified. Maybe I'm just naturally good at connecting with beautiful, deadly warrior women. The forest immediately betrayed her reaction with a burst of pink light, making her scowl at the surrounding trees. The flora here has no discretion. The flora here, Ken suggested, seems pretty wise to me. He held out his hand. Shall we go see what other impossible things might happen over dinner? After a moment's hesitation, Rena took his offered hand. The resulting surge of energy made them both gasp, while the forest erupted in a celebration of light around them. Impossible, Rena whispered again, but this time she was smiling. Back at the cave, Ken rummaged through his emergency supplies while Rena watched with curiosity. The moss walls pulsed with a gentle, interested glow that seemed to match her mood. So, Ken announced, pulling out his portable cooking unit, I promised you a non-ritualistic dinner. Though I should warn you, Earth cuisine might be an adventure all its own. Everything about you is an adventure, Rena observed, moving closer to examine the device. What is this mechanism? Just a basic heat converter. Watch. He activated the unit, and a small blue flame sprouted from its center. Rena immediately dropped into a defensive crouch, her hand reaching for a weapon. Whoa! Ken raised his hands. It's just for cooking. Not a weapon, I promise. You create controlled fire? For food? She straightened slowly, but her eyes remained wary. Our legends speak of firebringers. They were not kind. Well, I'm more of a fire borrower, he grinned, pulling out a packet of dehydrated stew. See? Totally harmless, unless you count my cooking skills. Rena edged closer again, her natural curiosity seemingly overwhelming her caution. Your people cannot communicate with plants for sustenance? Sadly, no. We have to make do with technology. He began rehydrating the stew. Though after experiencing your forest, I'm thinking we might be doing it wrong. Many things about your people seem backward, but her tone was teasing rather than critical. Creating fire instead of drawing energy, using machines instead of listening to life's rhythm. Says the woman whose plants act like mood rings, Ken countered, stirring the stew. Speaking of which, is the cave moss always this chatty? The walls were indeed putting on quite a display, swirling with patterns that seemed to follow their interaction. Rena shot the moss an irritated look. It responds to compatibility, she said carefully. Energy resonance. Like what happened during the trial. Ken ladled some stew into a bowl, trying to sound casual despite his racing heart. Because that was intense. Intense, she repeated the word as if tasting it. Yes, and impossible. You keep saying that. He handed her the bowl, their fingers brushing deliberately. The cave immediately flared pink. I'm starting to think you like impossible things. Rena stared at the bowl, then at him, her inner fire dancing in her eyes. Perhaps I am developing a tolerance for them. Just a tolerance? He prepared his own bowl, moving to sit beside her. And here I thought we were having a moment in that circle. A moment? She sampled the stew cautiously, then blinked in surprise. This is not unpleasant. High praise indeed, Ken laughed. But you're avoiding the subject. The energy between us, the light show, that wasn't just basic harmonizing, was it? Rena was quiet for a long moment, studying her bowl. The cave moss dimmed to a soft, intimate purple. No, she finally admitted. It was something our eldest have only spoken of in stories. A perfect resonance. Joining of energies. Joining of energies? Ken raised an eyebrow. That sounds serious. Should I have brought flowers first? Her laugh escaped before she could suppress it. You make light of everything. Not everything, he said softly, setting down his bowl. Not the way you looked at me in that circle. Not the way it felt when our energies connected. The cave moss exploded in brilliant patterns of gold and pink. Rena's skin seemed to glow from within, her own bioluminescence responding to her emotions. You are dangerous, she whispered, but didn't move away when he shifted closer. More dangerous than your carnivorous plants? Far more. Her eyes met his, that inner fire blazing. The plants only hunger for energy. You, you make me hunger for impossible things. The air between them crackled with that same electric energy from the trial. Ken reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and trace the glowing patterns on her arm. Her sharp intake of breath was accompanied by a surge of light from the walls. Maybe impossible things are worth hungering for, he suggested, his voice low. Rena's free hand came up to cover his, sending sparks of energy dancing between them. The elders would say I am being foolish. The elders said I was impossible, but that worked out pretty well. Did it? But she was smiling now, that rare, unguarded expression that made his heart skip. Perhaps we should conduct more trials to be certain. What kind of trials did you have in mind? Instead of answering, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The contact sent a shock of energy through them both, and the cave erupted in a symphony of light and color. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, the moss was putting on the most spectacular display Ken had ever seen. Well, he managed after a moment, that was definitely impossible. Completely impossible, Rena agreed, but she hadn't moved away. If anything, she seemed to be glowing brighter, her natural bioluminescence responding to her emotions. Should we try it again? You know, for science. Her laugh was free this time, unreserved. You are impossible, he finished for her. I know, but I'm your kind of impossible. The cave moss pulsed in agreement as he pulled her in for another kiss, their energies intertwining just as they had in the trial circle. And if the forest outside their cave began to sparkle with unprecedented patterns of light, well, that was just another impossible thing to add to the list. The next few days fell into a rhythm as peculiar as it was pleasant. Ken worked on repairing the Starweaver while Rena supervised, though her supervision increasingly involved teaching him about Ursa's transformed ecosystem and stealing kisses when she thought the forest wasn't watching. It always was. These spores, Ken noted, scanning a particularly vibrant patch of fungus near his ship. They're actually processing the metal oxides in the soil. Fascinating. Careful, Rena warned, pulling him back by his collar. Some varieties can be aggressive with outsiders. Aggressive fungi. Why am I not surprised? He turned to face her, still within her grasp, though I seem to recall a certain warrior being pretty aggressive with outsiders too. The surrounding plants shifted to that telling pink hue as Rena's fingers lingered on his collar. I was merely being cautious. Is that what we're calling it now? Because I distinctly remember accusations about eating you. You are never going to let that go, are you? But her eyes danced with amusement. Never, he confirmed, pulling her closer. It's not every day a beautiful woman accuses me of trying to consume her essence. Their playful banter was interrupted by a sudden wave of dizziness that hit Ken like a gravity shift. He stumbled, and Rena's teasing expression immediately turned to concern. Ken? Her hand pressed against his forehead, and her eyes widened. You're burning. Just got a little lightheaded, he tried to reassure her, but the world was starting to spin in interesting ways. Maybe those spores were more aggressive than we thought. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was Rena's face, illuminated by the forest's alarmed red glow. He drifted in and out of awareness, caught in fever dreams where light and energy danced through his veins. Sometimes he heard voices arguing, "The spores are transforming him." An elder's voice sharp with concern. "No," Rena's voice fierce and protective. "They're adapting him, like the forest did to us." Other times he felt energy flowing into him, cool and soothing against the fever's burn. Through it all, he was aware of Rena's presence, her energy intertwined with his, anchoring him to reality. When he finally opened his eyes properly, the cave moss was creating gentle patterns of healing green light. Rena sat beside him, her hand clasped in his, her skin glowing with fatigue. "Welcome back, impossible man," she said softly. "Did I miss anything exciting?" His voice was rough, but the fog in his head had cleared. "Only my sisters threatening to burn your ship, the forest having a collective panic attack, and me nearly starting a civil war." She squeezed his hand. The usual. "Just another day on Irza, then?" He tried to sit up, and she helped steady him. "How long was I out?" 3 cycles of the moons." Her free hand traced the patterns now etched into his skin, faint lines of bioluminescence that hadn't been there before. The spores, they changed you, like they changed us generations ago. Ken examined his arm with fascination. In the cave's dim light, he could see subtle markings that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. I'm guessing this isn't standard medical treatment on Earth. You could have died, there was an edge to her voice now. The elders wanted to let the transformation take its course, as tradition demands. But I couldn't let go of your impossible man. He smiled up at her, noting how the cave moss reflected both their emotional states now. His wonder, her relief. I should have been more careful, she said, but he caught her hand before she could pull away. Hey, he tugged her closer until their foreheads touched, sending sparks of energy dancing between them. I'm okay. Better than okay if these cool new glowy bits are anything to go by. You truly cannot take anything seriously. But her voice broke slightly. I take us seriously, he whispered, pulling back just enough to meet her gaze. I take this seriously. He gestured to where their energies were visibly interweaving, creating patterns of light that put the cave moss to shame. The elders say the transformation is permanent, she warned. You're bound to Urza now, like we are. Bound to Urza, he pretended to consider this. You mean I'm stuck on a beautiful planet with amazing bioluminescent everything, and a gorgeous warrior woman who occasionally accuses me of trying to eat her? However will I cope? That startled a laugh from her, and the cave's light brightened in response. Impossible man. You're impossible man, he corrected, pulling her down for a kiss that sent ripples of light cascading through both their newly synchronized bioluminescence. And I wouldn't have it any other way. The forest outside their cave erupted in a celebration of color, as if Urza itself was approving of their union. And if the elders were scandalized by this unprecedented development, well, they would just have to get used to impossible things. Ken's transformation brought unexpected changes beyond the visible bioluminescent markings. He found himself increasingly attuned to Urza's rhythms, able to sense the flow of energy through the ecosystem. Most intriguingly, his connection with Rena deepened in ways that transcended physical attraction. You're doing it wrong, Rena observed as Ken attempted to communicate with a cluster of reactive vines. The plants writhed in confusion, creating a discordant display of colors. I thought you said to project my intentions clearly. He frowned, watching the vines tie themselves in literal knots. Your intentions are perfectly clear, she smirked, moving behind him. That's the problem. What's that supposed to mean? But he leaned back into her touch as she positioned his hands correctly. The plants are picking up on other thoughts. Her breath tickled his ear. The surrounding vegetation immediately shifted to that telling pink hue. That's hardly my fault. Ken turned to face her, keeping their bodies close. Someone very distracting keeps touching me. Perhaps you need better focus. But her eyes sparkled with mischief. More discipline. Oh, and how would you suggest I develop this discipline? His hands found her waist, sending ripples of light dancing across both their skins where they touched. Well, she pretended to consider, even as their shared energy created increasingly elaborate patterns in the air around them. Traditional training usually involves isolation, meditation, and absolute concentration. Sounds boring, he pulled her closer. I prefer hands-on learning. Impossible man, she murmured, but tilted her head up to meet his kiss. The forest around them exploded in sympathetic illumination, their combined energy creating displays that would have put Earth's greatest light shows to shame. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ken noticed they had attracted an audience. A group of younger warriors stood at the edge of the clearing, trying and failing to hide their fascination with the spectacle. Ever since Ken's transformation, there had been growing curiosity about this unprecedented development among Rena's people. Don't you have duties to attend to? Rena called out, her authoritative tone somewhat undermined by the way her skin still glowed with emotion. Elder Venna sent us, one of the braver warriors replied. She wishes to study the resonance patterns. Study them yourself, another whispered, earning giggles from her companions. Ken felt Rena tense beside him. Relations with the elders had been strained since she defied them during his fever. Tell Elder Venna that we'd be happy to demonstrate, Ken interrupted smoothly. After all, Scientific observation is very important. Rena shot him a look that promised retribution, but he just grinned. Trust me, he whispered. I have an idea. Ken's demonstration for Elder Venna turned out to be more revolutionary than anyone expected. In the sacred gathering circle, surrounded by curious warriors and suspicious elders, he and Rena stood hand in hand, their shared bioluminescence creating intricate patterns in the air between them. The changed ones, Ken addressed the assembly, his voice carrying easily through the charged atmosphere, gave your people the ability to connect with Urza's life force. But they didn't just change you, they changed the entire ecosystem, created something entirely new. We know our history, outsider, Venna interjected, though her eyes tracked the dancing lights with obvious fascination. Do you? Ken squeezed Rena's hand, sending a pulse of energy through their connection that made the surrounding plants sparkle. Because I think you've only scratched the surface of what's possible. Ken, Rena whispered warningly, but he pressed on. Watch this, he grinned, then closed his eyes and concentrated. The patterns of their combined energy began to shift, forming recognizable shapes, stars, planets, entire galaxies in miniature swirling around them. Gasps erupted from the assembled warriors as Ken projected his memories of space travel through their shared energy field. The forest responded enthusiastically, amplifying their display until the entire clearing was filled with a spectacular recreation of the cosmos. Impossible, Venna breathed, but there was wonder in her voice now rather than suspicion. That word keeps coming up. Ken opened his eyes, meeting Rena's stunned gaze. But I'm starting to think it just means we haven't tried hard enough yet. Rena's free hand came up to trace one of the glowing constellations. You're showing us your stars. Our stars now, he corrected softly, if you want them to be. The implications of that statement rippled through the gathering like a shockwave. The forest colors shifted rapidly, reflecting the mixed emotions of the assembled Amazons. Surprise, uncertainty, hope. You suggest leaving Urza? One of the elders stepped forward, her tone sharp. After generations of isolation? I suggest choice, Ken replied, maintaining his calm even as the energy patterns around them intensified. The changes made you stronger, faster, more connected to life itself. But they didn't chain you to this planet. You could explore the stars while maintaining your connection to Ursa. You could share your gifts with the galaxy. And what of the hunters? Another elder demanded. Those who would seek to consume our essence? About that, Ken's grin turned mischievous as he pulled Rena closer. I think there's been a slight misunderstanding about consumption. The forest immediately betrayed Rena's embarrassment with a burst of pink light, making several younger warriors giggle. You see, Ken continued, enjoying both the audience's reaction and Rena's growing mortification. When I say I want to consume every moment with her, or that I'm consumed by my feelings, it's not quite the literal interpretation you're thinking of. Ken, Rena hissed, though her skin glowed brighter with each word, I will feed you to the plants. No, you won't, he said confidently. You like my impossible ideas too much. The younger warriors were openly laughing now, while even some of the elders seemed to be fighting smiles. The forest colors had shifted to warm, amused golds and pinks. Venna stepped forward, studying their intertwined energy patterns with new interest. You truly believe our people could venture beyond Irza without losing our connection to it? I believe, Ken met her gaze steadily, that true connection isn't about physical proximity. It's about resonance, harmony. He looked at Rena, his expression softening. Love. The words sent a ripple of light cascading through their joined hands, and the forest erupted in a spectacular display of color. Rena's eyes widened as she processed his meaning. Love, she repeated carefully, testing the word. Another of your metaphorical consumptions? The best kind, he smiled. The kind where both people grow stronger together, not weaker apart. Impossible, man. But her voice was thick with emotion, and the patterns of their shared energy had never been brighter. You're impossible, man, he corrected, then turned back to address the assembly. So, who wants to learn about interstellar navigation? The enthusiasm from the younger warriors was immediate and overwhelming. Even some of the elders leaned forward with poorly concealed interest as Ken began explaining basic space travel concepts, using their combined energy to create vivid illustrations. Throughout it all, Rena never let go of his hand, their connection growing stronger with each passing moment. And if the forest seemed particularly pleased with this development, well, maybe impossible things were becoming the new normal on Urza. As twilight descended over Irsa, Ken stood before his repaired ship, the Starweaver's hull now bearing intricate patterns that mimicked the forest's bioluminescence. Rena traced the markings with her fingers, sending ripples of light dancing across the metal. "You've adapted her," she observed, admiring how the ship seemed to pulse in harmony with the surrounding flora. "Like Urza adapted you." "Well, I figured if I'm going to be the galaxy's first glowing pilot, my ship should match." Ken grinned, catching her hand and pulling her close. "Though I'm more interested in how often you'll be co-piloting." The forest around them shifted to warm, anticipatory colors as Rena smiled. "The elders have agreed to establish an ambassador program. Selected warriors will venture out to learn about the stars while maintaining our connection to Urza. And would one of these selected warriors happen to be a certain beautiful blue-skinned woman who once thought I wanted to eat her?" "Perhaps," her eyes sparkled with that inner fire he'd grown to love, "though she still thinks you're impossible." "Good," he pulled her into a kiss that sent cascades of light rippling through both their bioluminescent markings. When they parted, the entire clearing was aglow with their combined energy. "You realize," Rena said softly, "that this changes everything. Our isolation, our traditions." "Change isn't always bad," Ken pointed out. "Look what happened when you took a chance on an impossible man." The forest pulsed in agreement, creating patterns that looked suspiciously like fireworks. Several young warriors watching from the trees didn't even try to hide their romantic sighs. "Besides," he continued, "think of all the fascinating cultural misunderstandings we have to look forward to. Wait until I introduce you to Earth's dating customs." "Dating?" Rena's brow furrowed. "Is this another form of consumption?" "Sort of," he laughed, "but more in the spending time together sense than the actually eating each other sense. Your people have very strange rituals." But she was smiling. "Perhaps we should conduct thorough research into these customs, for diplomatic purposes, of course." "Of course," Ken agreed solemnly, though his eyes danced with mischief. "Very thorough research. Starting with this." He pulled her into another kiss, this one deeper, more passionate. The forest responded with an explosion of color that rivaled a supernova, their combined energy creating patterns never before seen on Ursa. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Elder Vena's voice rang out from the gathering crowd. "The stars await," she announced formally. "May your journey forge new paths for our people while honoring the old ways. And may you not actually consume each other," a younger warrior added cheekily, earning herself a stern look from the elders and laughs from her companions. "No promises," Ken winked, making Rena roll her eyes even as the forest betrayed her amusement with pulses of pink light. As they prepared to board the Starweaver for their first journey together, Ken paused at the entrance. "You know, when I crashed here, I thought it was the worst luck ever. Turns out it was the best crash landing in history. The only good crash landing is one you walk away from." Rena quoted his earlier words back to him. "Though in this case, I suppose walking away together is even better." "Together," Ken agreed, their energies interweaving in now familiar patterns. "Ready to explore the impossible?" Rena's answer was to pull him into one more kiss, their combined light show causing the ship's new bioluminescent patterns to pulse in sympathy. The forest joined in the celebration, creating a farewell display that would be talked about for generations. As the Starweaver lifted off, carrying them toward their first shared adventure, the clearing erupted in a final burst of color. Their departure wasn't an ending, but a beginning, a promise of more impossible things to come. After all, in a universe where a crashed pilot and a warrior who feared being eaten could fall in love, anything was possible. And somewhere among the stars, new adventures awaited the impossible couple and their glowing ship. The forest of Irza would be watching, ready to welcome them home whenever they returned. Because some connections, like the one between a transformed human and his warrior love, transcended even the vast distances between stars. Dear listeners, Perhaps you're wondering what happens next. What adventures await our luminescent lovers among the stars? What might occur when Rena and her warrior sisters first set foot on Earth, where the plants don't glow and humans don't naturally radiate energy? Imagine the delightful chaos as the Amazons of Urza encounter Earth's customs, technology, and social norms. Picture Rena's reaction to her first Earth shopping mall, or Ken trying to explain why humans spend so much time staring at their phones instead of connecting with the life energy around them. What would Earth scientists make of these blue-skinned, bioluminescent warriors who can communicate with plants? And how would Earth's forests respond to the presence of beings so deeply connected to natural energy? The story of Urza's Amazons on Earth promises new misunderstandings, deeper connections, and perhaps even more impossible love stories waiting to unfold. Would you like to hear these tales? To follow Rena and her sisters as they navigate our world with their unique perspective and abilities? Let us know, dear listeners. For just as the forest of Urza pulses with living light, your enthusiasm and interest make these stories glow brighter. Until our next impossible adventure, keep your hearts open to the magic of connection, whether it comes from distant stars or right here on Earth. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with a simple misunderstanding about who wants to eat whom. So shall we begin the next chapter? Would you like to hear how Earth's cities look through eyes accustomed to bioluminescent forests? How our world changes when viewed through the lens of those who can see the very essence of life itself? The choice is yours, dear listeners. The Amazons of Urza await your answer.